Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. This may actually be a very short episode because, as you know, over the weekend, we've had two shootings. We had the mass shooting in El Paso, which, as of the recording of this, took either 19 or 20 lives, and then we had the shooting in Dayton, which took 8 or 9 lives, and then dozens injured. And, of course, everybody's apoplectic about gun violence in the United States. Every single death is a tragedy, whether that death is, I guess with the exception of a natural death, just dying by old age, but I guess any death that is other than a natural death, a car wreck, disease, self-inflicted gunshot wound, or self-inflicted suicide by vehicle, or whatever it might be. A death that is not natural is apparently a death that cries out for attention by the news media. Unless, of course, that death is one of the leading causes of death. And I suppose at this point we've just accepted that, well, let's go to the CDC. Now, I haven't had time to compilate or compile the leading causes of death for 2017. That's the last PDF that the Centers for Disease Control has on the numbers of deaths for leading causes of death. Now, if you don't believe any of these numbers, all you have to do is go to cdc.gov, and look in the National Center for Health Statistics, or just, in your search engine, just put CDC leading causes of death. And you'll find numerous stories, but in particular, you'll find stories from the Centers for Disease Control about the leading causes of death. Before we get to the shootings that occurred last week, I want to go through the leading causes of death. There are listed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They list the top 10 leading causes of death in the United States. Heart disease is number 1. And in 2016, 647,457 people, or roughly 650,000 people, died of heart disease. That's the number 1 cause of death in the United States. Number 2, cancer. Close by at 599,108. Let's say 600,000. Very close to heart disease. So heart disease and cancer, the top 2 leading causes of death. Then the third leading cause is just accidents. Falling downstairs, automobile accidents, playground accidents, just unintentional injuries. There is a precipitous drop from heart disease and cancer, 650,000, 600,000, to unintentional injuries, which in 2016, that was the third leading cause of death at 169,936, 170,000 deaths. So you can see there's a significant drop from 600,000 to 170,000. And then there's a shorter drop to the fourth leading cause of death, which is chronic lower respiratory diseases, 160,201. Then there's another slight drop to the, to the fifth cause of death, which is stroke, cerebral vascular diseases. The fifth leading causes of death in the United States are strokes at 146,383. Then the sixth is Alzheimer's, a horrible way to die, 121,404, followed by diabetes at 83,564. At number 7 is influenza and pneumonia, 55,672. At number 9 is nephritis, nephrotic syndrome, and nephrosis, 50,633. And at the very bottom do we find number 10, do we find the first indication that a firearm is a subset of the 10th leading causes of death in the United States, which is suicide, intentional self-harm, 47,173. All of these leading causes of death are tragic. They're horrific ways to die. You have a myocardial infarction, you have a major heart attack, cancer. I don't want to die of cancer. Accidents. People die on the highways and the byways of this country every single day. Chronic lower respiratory diseases, 160,000. Stroke, 146,000. Alzheimer's, diabetes, influenza, pneumonia, nephritis, nephrotic syndrome, nephrosis. And then you get to the intentional self-harm, suicide. Not all of which are by firearms, only a portion of which are by firearms. So what is it that drives the national attention to the very, very small number of people who are murdered with a gun by someone else? Well, I think there are a couple of factors, and I'm trying to be as objective as I can about this. But I think one of the factors that leads to the hyper coverage is that a mass shooter who either succeeds or fails, but someone who attempts a mass shooting generally does it in a place where you least expect it. You're in a Walmart, for example. People walking around in Walmart don't expect somebody to walk in with any kind of gun and just randomly start shooting people. We had that happen in a Denver suburb not long ago, seems like maybe a year or so ago. And we had a man attempting mass murder in a Walmart. And I'll never forget, there were, and I don't remember the number, but there were at least a dozen concealed carry permit holders in that Walmart. And I remember the sheriff complaining at the time that the reason it was taking so long to clear the scene was because they had to clear all of those concealed carry permit holders to make certain that they were not part of the crime or that they weren't the one that had shot the perpetrator or whatever else. And I remember just being astonished, because that is the subtle indication of how the culture in the country is changing regarding firearms. And if you don't think that it's changing, all you need to do is watch the news, or have watched the news over the past 72 hours. Beto O'Rourke actually blamed Donald Trump for the shootings. I'll play that soundbite for you in a minute, but he literally blamed Donald Trump for the shootings. And then when he had an opportunity to walk that back, he actually dug his feet in further, dug his heels in deeper. So I think the reason we get such hyperbolic coverage of shootings is that they often occur where we least expect it, or they occur as the stem cell shooting, in Denver, Colorado, Highlands Ranch, Colorado, as the one that occurred last spring. It occurs in a school. So I think that these shootings garner the level of attention they do because they happen in places where we least expect it. But when you try to be rational and you try to look at the statistics of the number of guns that are used in homicides or used in murders or used in any kind of gun violence, to use the vernacular of the media, you find that the numbers are very, very small. Yet the coverage is outrageously out of perspective. And again, I think that's because of it occurs in places where you least expect it. I admit that I have been remiss over I can think of 4 or 5 times in the past couple of weeks. I'm a concealed carry permit holder, and I keep I keep a loaded weapon in my home. I keep a loaded weapon in my vehicle. And I usually conceal carry whenever I'm in public. Whenever I'm in public. And as these shootings occurred over the past 72 hours, I've thought to myself of I'm thinking 4 times that I can specifically think of that I either went to dinner with friends or was out in public or whatever and didn't have my concealed carry weapon with me. And I realized how foolish that was on my part. I don't know. I know there were some concealed carry permit holders, right? Well, I can't say that for a fact, but I think I've read somewhere that there were some concealed carry permit holders in the Walmart. I don't know whether they had an opportunity to take out the shooter or not. I'm not going to second guess them. I know that myself as a concealed carry permit holder, if I'm by myself in a Walmart and a shooting starts, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take cover to protect myself. If I have Tamara with me, or if I've got my grandchildren with me, or anybody else, I'm going to first take cover to protect them. And I'm going to try to escape from the scene if possible. And only third, if I am afforded an opportunity to take out the shooter, will I attempt to take out the shooter. But if I don't have my weapon with me, I never have that opportunity. I'm then solely dependent upon law enforcement or another concealed carry permit holder of protecting me or anybody with me in a public place. And I think that's where there is a disconnect between those of us who are staunch supporters of not the Second Amendment, but the right of self-defense, which is separate and apart from the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear arms. And it does it and I think you could make a reasonable argument that the Second Amendment, which in the Heller case, the U.S. Supreme Court case decided several years ago, in the Heller case, Justice Scalia found that the Second Amendment is an individual right, much like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to due process, the right against self-incrimination. The Second Amendment, like those other rights, is an individual right. It is not a collective right. So on those occasions where I have gone into a public space without my weapon, I have failed to exercise my individual right to keep and bear arms, and I have then made myself totally dependent on either my ability to take cover, to escape, or somebody else other than my own personal responsibility. I have abdicated that personal responsibility to either my ability to escape or to take cover and hide, or I've abdicated it to law enforcement or to someone else. And that's wrong. Because I have not only an obligation to myself, but I have an obligation to others, in my opinion, that as a responsible gun owner and as a person who believes in a constitutional right to carry, I do not believe that you should have to have a license to conceal carry a weapon. I believe that I also have an obligation that when I'm in the public to, again, first protect myself, but if I do have the opportunity, if the opportunity is presented to me, then I do have the obligation to try to take out someone who is trying to kill someone else. None of that occurred in these other places. It didn't occur at all. But I want to go to what started this episode, this particular podcast. And that is, why do we have this over-the-top coverage? And I believe it is really because of 2 factors. One, I do believe, and I can't distinguish a percentage, like 50% or is this and 50% is that, or 60-40 or whatever. But I do believe that the coverage is because these things occur where we don't expect them to occur. We expect people, I guess, to die of heart disease, and we expect people to die of cancer. We expect people to die of accidents. We expect people to die of chronic lower respiratory diseases or stroke or Alzheimer's or diabetes or influenza or stroke or intentional self-harm. We expect those things, so the media never rushes in like bugs to a bug light to offer their opinion and to incessantly cover every potential angle and to run to politicians and to ask them what they think about this or that. It's out of control. It is literally out of control. So regardless of what the percentage is, let's just say that a lot of the coverage of mass shootings is because they occur because they happen in places where we don't expect shootings to occur. I suppose that's why we don't hear about the one person on I-25 that died in an automobile accident over the past week. Or we don't hear about the grandfather that died of cancer, or the friend that had heart disease unbeknownst to him and died of a heart attack suddenly, or someone who died of a stroke unexpectedly at the ripe old age of 52. None of that gets coverage. Now, if there's a mass accident, like the truck driver, we had a truck driver coming down I-70, lost control of his vehicle, failed to use the out-of-control truck ramps, and killed people as he came down I-70 into the flatlands of Denver. Oh, that got coverage because it tore up Interstate 70 and blocked the interstate in both directions, and you had a massive fireball, and you had cars strewn all over the place. So it was the kind of coverage that you would naturally expect the news media to flock to because it had everything. It had death and destruction. It had flames and fire. It had destruction of a highway. It had all of the elements that you need, just like in a mass shooting. So I think that a lot of the coverage of the mass shootings are driven by the emotional trauma that is present, that everybody can run and they can stick the microphone into a first responder. They can set a microphone in the face or a TV camera in the face of a victim or a bystander or somebody who saw something or the loved one of a victim. They can exploit it. Let me say it again. They can exploit the tragedy to their own benefit. To their own benefit. Because the massive, over-the-top, continuous coverage of a mass shooting does nothing to inform me about the causes or the 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, why. That can be done in one simple news report, as opposed to B-roll footage that just loops over and over and over and over again. As many of you know, on Sunday mornings, I watch CBS Sunday Morning, and I watched it Sunday morning, and I found myself screaming at the television. Dr. John LaPook, who is apparently one of the house doctors of CBS News, talked to some doctors on their efforts to confront gun violence.
Who here has seen a gunshot victim?
I think people think that if their loved one gets to the hospital that there's magic there, but sometimes it's just too much for us.
If there was ever a time for preventive medicine, it's now, says this group of doctors.
A grandfather was shot yesterday. A son was shot yesterday. Yesterday, a mother was shot yesterday. And then the day before that, there were 5 other people that were shot that were connected to Americans in this country.
I'm curious. Now these are a group of doctors. I think University of Texas, Rutgers, they're various doctors from various hospitals. So he just rattled off what? Maybe a half dozen or a dozen people that died of a gunshot wound over the past several days. I wonder if that same doctor or other emergency room doctors would like to rattle off the number of car accident victims or other accident victims that they've seen in their emergency rooms over the same period of time. But we don't get that coverage because the media only wants us to hear about the gunshots.
They've had enough and seen enough.
The only thing worse than a death is a death that could be prevented.
I found that statement utterly fascinating. The only thing worse than a death is a death that could be prevented. Well, let's go back to the list. Let's go back to the leading causes of death. Heart disease, in many cases preventable, depending upon diet and exercise, depending on how well you take care of yourself. But I also believe that some heart disease is inevitable, and some people are just destined to die of heart attacks. Cancer. Some cancers are preventable. Some cancers are curable. Some are not. Accidents. The leading causes of death. Unintentional injuries. 169,936 people died. An accident is, by its very definition, preventable. Safety measures, safety actions, the way you drive, the way you if you're on a construction site, any number of things, if you follow the rules, you generally can prevent accidents. But accidents by their very nature are accidents. So whether they're preventable or not depends on the particular circumstances of that particular accident. But I was just struck by the fact that the doctor wanted to point out that there's nothing worse than a death other than a preventable death.
And to go and talk to a mom of a child who was normal at breakfast and now is not here is the worst possible thing. And
notice, and I agree, the worst possible thing is to go talk to a mother whose child in the morning was fine, but at noon on the playground fell and hit his head on concrete and suffered irreversible brain damage or something that caused bleeding in the brain, and they couldn't stop it, and the pressure in the child succumbed to the injury. Or a teenager who leaves the house, gets in the car, and you get that horrific phone call that your son or daughter has been involved in an accident and they have perished. Preventable? More likely than not, it was preventable. So notice they talk about preventable, but they don't talk about guns yet.
honestly, it drives us. It drives us to address this problem.
Doctors Ronald Stewart, Albert Osbar, Neva Lubin-Johnson, Stephanie Bonney, Chris Barsotti, Megan Rainey, and Roger Mitchell were in Chicago this past winter as more than 40 medical organizations who normally operate separately joined forces.
We have nurses, we have doctors, we have sociologists. How is it that we can disseminate this knowledge that we're creating?
Has anything like this ever happened before in terms of discussing gun violence?
No.
And we recognize that this is an epidemic that we can address.
An epidemic. I'm not sure what their definition of epidemic is, but it's not even in the top 10 leading causes of death. And that's not to minimize. Do not misunderstand me. I am not minimizing the tragic death, the tragic murder of any one individual by another.
Their meeting followed a tweet from the National Rifle Association last November that helped fuel a movement.
The NRA tweets out, someone should tell self-important anti-gun doctors to stay in their lane.
As I was leaving the hospital, I just turned around and snapped a picture of the waiting room.
Dr. Bonney, a trauma surgeon in Newark, New Jersey, posted the photo to Twitter along with this message.
Hey, NRA, do you want to see my lane? Here's the chair that I sit in when I tell parents that their kids are dead.
Notice again, there's nothing but an assumption that when she says, here's the chair that I sit in when I tell parents that their children are dead, does she only treat gunshot wounds? Does she only deal with children that die of gunshots? No, I'm quite sure she deals with other tragedies and accidents also. But again, the coverage is about guns, and they're trying to draw you in emotionally. They were trying to draw me in emotionally on Sunday morning about this wave of epidemic of violence. It only appears to be a wave of epidemic of violence because the media makes it so, just as CBS Sunday Morning was yesterday.
And you hit send, and then what happens?
I was part of a chorus.
A chorus of thousands of medical professionals who responded, "This is our lane."
Our motto is do no harm for physicians. But I think the community felt that harm was being done to us by that tweet.
I remember sitting there and thinking, how can you lecture docs, many of whom are gun owners, about what we do and don't know? And how can you...
Physician Megan Rainey is Chief Research Officer for Affirm, an organization trying to address gun violence through the same tools doctors use to combat problems like obesity, the opioid crisis, and heart disease.
That $2.5 million fund that we are raising is going to be to help us identify the shooters before they shoot.
This public health approach is not new. In the 1950s, doctors worked with the auto industry to help make cars and roads safer.
See, now, just to give you a heads up, CBS Sunday Morning now veers into, here's how we solved all of these other problems. In the 1950s, the government and the car manufacturers got together to reduce automobile deaths, which they did, but they didn't eliminate.
We can state clinically that the severe crushing injury to the chest of the driver has been reduced by 1/2 by the safety steering wheel.
In the 60s and 70s, they spoke out against the dangers of tobacco.
Yet, lung cancer, cancers in general, remain the number 2 leading causes of death.
It is the judgment of the committee that cigarette smoking contributes substantially to mortality from certain specific diseases and to the overall death rate.
And in the 80s and 90s, to combat HIV and AIDS, they promoted safe sex and research.
The best protection against infection right now, barring abstinence, is the use of a condom.
Today,
I would argue that the best protection against being killed by a deranged mass shooter in a Walmart is to understand the art of self-defense, is to understand situational awareness, is to, just like they talked about with AIDS, practicing safe sex. In this case, learning the art of practicing self-defense.
Today, the focus is gun violence in all its forms. It may surprise you to know that mass shootings make up less than 1% of firearm-related deaths.
1%. 1% of firearm deaths, mass shootings.
Leading cause is suicide, followed by homicide and then accidents.
It points out 60% suicides, 30% homicides, 1% accidents. If they want to study suicide, if the CDC, if they want to give taxpayer money to study suicide and how to prevent suicide, because that's the leading cause. Mass shootings are 1%. Suicides, 60% of deaths by firearm. Homicides are 30%. Now, I want to focus for just a moment on the 30% of homicides, because Of those 30%, a homicide is just the killing of another human by a human. You have lawful, legal, justifiable homicide, and then you have murder, manslaughter, and the other homicides.
But good answers on how best to prevent these deaths are hard to come by.
This is an issue of federally funded political advocacy, an attempt by the CDC to bring about gun control advocacy all over the United States.
That's because of 1996 legislation defunding any research at the CDC promoting gun control.
Promoting gun control. The CDC should not be in the business of promoting gun control, and that's why the law was passed in 1996. The Centers for Disease Control, if they want to study mental health issues and how mental health issues or people with mental health issues use guns, I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem with the Centers for Disease Control studying gun control.
$2.6 million from the CDC budget was reallocated, and it had a chilling effect on almost all firearm research.
What was lost was 20-some years of effort to understand and prevent a huge health problem.
Dr. Garen Wintemute's work on handgun violence lost government funding after Congress passed that 1996 legislation.
Consciously, deliberately, repeatedly, over and over, we turned our back on this problem.
And I just want to pause it and stop it there. It goes on and becomes even more irritating. Everybody looked and everybody complained, this doctor in particular, complained that 20 years ago in 1996 that he lost his federal funding to study gun control. How about Moms Demand Action? How about Michael Bloomberg? How about Tom Steyer? How about all of these billionaires that want to spend money advocating for gun control? How about they sponsor research grants on mental health as it relates to guns? Why should we have the federal government doing that? I don't think we should. You'll hear over the next several days ongoing discussion and politicians on both sides of the aisle talking about this solution or that solution. You'll hear the phrase common sense gun control legislation, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. I'm just over it. Let me go back to the point that I made about my failure that I could think, the 4 times I could think of over the past couple of weeks that I have not carried my weapon with me while I've been in public. A friend of mine posted on Facebook the following: "Enough is enough. Folks, carry a gun with you at all times and in all places, and know how to use it as well. Put on your calendar the next few months a major quality training course, and then put another one and another one on the calendar too. Practice those things you learn religiously. Get to the range regularly, but also do a fair amount of daily, yes, daily dry fire practice." He's exactly right. And finally, I just want to talk about social media for a moment. I understand that social media is a pathetic dredge of society. But when I first learned of these shootings, I made a conscious decision to stay off Twitter and to stay off Facebook because I didn't want to be drawn into any sort of debate or get my blood pressure up or anything else about all of the dumbassery that I would read on Facebook and Twitter. So I just, for Friday night, Saturday, and for most of Sunday, I stayed off all social media platforms. And then Sunday morning, I woke up and I thought, well, I'm just going to see what one of my lists of people that I read religiously, what they're saying. And then I looked at my notifications. And in my notifications, a follower had written to someone that is based in Tokyo, something to the effect that if you want some really good stats about homicides and, you know, the whole thing about gun statistics, you should listen to Michael Brown's podcast. You should read his tweets and look at some of the information that he posts. He posts really good information about it. To which this person replied, based on his tweets, meaning me, based on his tweets, the guy looks like a fascist nut job who chooses party over country. I want people like this, meaning me, I want people like this murdered on both sides of the political spectrum until there is only those of us left that actually want to unify the country and move forward. So I retweeted that tweet with this comment. I've purposely stayed off Twitter the past 48 hours, but looked this morning only to find someone calling me a fascist nut job that should be murdered. What is wrong with people, and why is this tweet still up? So I reported the tweet to Twitter as advocating violence against me. I don't fear death threats. In fact, most of the time when I hear people brag about how many death threats they get, I think to myself, you've never really had a real death threat. But I reported it nonetheless because I just can. And I wanted to do it just to cause this dirtbag some trouble. So I reported it to Twitter as a threat of violence directed at me personally. Twitter responded some 6-7 hours later, about 4 or 5 o'clock Sunday afternoon. And here's what they wrote. Hello. We're writing to let you know that we did not find the content you reported to be in violation of our rules. We know this is disappointing to hear, as you had a reason to report it in the first place. We seek to consider context and to see the full picture before deciding whether reported content or accounts violate our rules. Sometimes an isolated comment in a broader conversation, or an opinion which differs extremely from yours, may not cross the line into violation. We get it. There's a lot online that isn't so nice. Speaking up is important, and we value you for that. While this decision isn't what you hoped, please let us know if there's additional context, tweets, or something we're missing. After all, we're human and far from perfect. Thanks, Twitter. I'm not quite sure what might be reported that depends upon context, or there might be an isolated comment in a broader conversation or an opinion which differs extremely from mine that doesn't cross the line into violation. When you say that you want people like me murdered on both sides of the political spectrum until there is only those of us left that actually want to unify the country and move forward, I don't know how much clearer it can get. He wants people like me murdered on both sides of the political spectrum. Twitter doesn't see a violation. Of course they don't. They're Twitter. I do notice, though, his account no longer exists. This is all I wanted to talk about today. I know you're going to hear an awful lot about these shootings. The only thing I would ask you to remind yourself every time you hear people going off the deep end about these shootings, they're isolated. There's not an epidemic. There are a lot more people killed by other things than guns. Guns barely make the top 10, and only in the context of suicide. Only in the context of suicide. Thanks for listening. You know, you can always find us wherever podcasts are found. If you'd like to follow me on social media, if you'd like to see some of the dumbassery that I see on Twitter, just follow me at Michael Brown USA. Follow me on Facebook, facebook.com/Michael D. Brown. And if you like the Facebook page, also ask to join the discussion group, Michael Brown Unplugged. And if you're not one of these trolls or one of these idiots like the guy that wanted to be murdered, we'll let you in that Facebook discussion group, and you can discuss things that I talk about on the podcast. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.